Hello everyone, and welcome to the first installment of a three-part webinar series incorporating ESL into your library. My name is Natalie Dunaway, and I'm the Continuing Education Coordinator with the Mississippi Library Commission. So, as I said, this is the first installment of a three-part series. In this webinar, we're just going to do a basic introduction to ESL, what it is. We're going to talk a little bit about language diversity in Mississippi, growing numbers of students, of ESL students in Mississippi schools. We're going to talk about just some basic concepts to kind of get the wheels turning for those of you who are interested in incorporating English as a second language services into your libraries and making your libraries a more English language learner, kind of friendly environments. In the second installment of this series, we talk about some basic factors that go into developing a conversation class. And in the third installment of this series, we talk about what goes into building a more traditional style class. And what I mean by traditional style, I mean a regularly meeting class that you gauge for outcomes. Okay? So again, this installment is just a quick introduction to ESL and how we can incorporate ESL services into our libraries and library programming. So let's get started. Okay. So first, what is ESL? Now I'm sure that many of you guys have heard ESL before. It's basically just an acronym for English as a Second Language. Some other acronyms you may hear me say throughout the webinar is EFL, English as a Foreign Language. So we use EFL when we're talking about English and English being learned in a place where the native language is not English. So for example, high school students in Japan taking English classes, we would say that that is English as a foreign language because the native language in Japan is not English, it's Japanese. Okay, and then ELL, this is a term that I use a lot. English language learner, that's what it stands for. Okay, so keep your ears out for that. You'll hear me drop those acronyms probably a number of times throughout this webinar and the following webinars. Okay, so let's talk about ESL and education. So very briefly, according to Mississippi Today, the number of ESL students in Mississippi is steadily growing. So again, Mississippi Today reported that between 2013 and 2016, the number of ESL students in Mississippi public schools grew by about 47%. That's a lot, you guys. That's a pretty big increase. From 7,739 to an estimated 11,404. And while most of these students are native Spanish speakers, there are many other languages represented across the state. And below here I have a link to Mississippi Today, that article. If you can't click on the hyperlink, you can just type it in. If you go to Google and type in Mississippi Today schools ESL, that article is sure to pop up. It's pretty popular. But again, most of these students are native Spanish speakers, but I really want to emphasize here that there are many other languages represented across our state, and it's a really awesome thing. Mississippi is really kind of linguistically diverse, and it's pretty exciting. So, what does Mississippi speak? So to your right, I just have this quick little graphic I made up. These numbers came from Migration Policy Institute and Data USA. In the second webinar, I show you guys how to use Data USA. It's really an awesome resource if you want to kind of get a snapshot of your populations in your communities and get some quick stats. It's really, really good to use. That's Data USA. And again, in the second webinar, I take you guys through like a little quick tutorial on how to use it. But okay, back to this. As of 2016, the total household population age 5 and over for Mississippi is about 2,796,802. That's as of 2016. Now I know as of maybe 2016 or 2018, the overall population of Mississippi, if you go to Data USA now, it's about 2.99 million. But remember, this is population age 5 and over for Mississippi. Okay, so out of this number, about 109,238 reported as speaking another language besides English at home. That's a lot of people who are speaking other languages besides English. Of that 109,000, approximately 41,942 people reported as speaking English as less than, quote, very well. This is the terminology that migration policy use on their survey. So less than, quote, very well, or less than proficient. So, okay. So stopping right here. So it looks like as of 2016 or around there, we have about 42,000 people who report as less than proficient at speaking English in Mississippi. That's a lot of people, you guys. And just for the sake of scale, we have 53 library systems in Mississippi, and if we were going to divide that up equally, that equals out to well over 750 people per library system. Now, obviously, different population densities are different in different areas. So it's not, I'm not saying that it's exactly 750 people per library system. Just for the sake of scale, if we divided that number across 53, you're going to get over 750 people. And that may not seem like a lot for a whole library system, but I can assure you, if you put 750 people in one library, or if you divide 750 people between two libraries, it's going to get pretty crowded pretty quickly. So that's a pretty hefty number of people. And just to your right, we've got some of the languages spoken across Mississippi aside from English. We've got about 3,700 native North American speakers, about 67,000 Spanish speakers. Well, that's a lot. 3,269 German speakers, 3,884 Chinese speakers, 6,981 Vietnamese speakers, and 3,889 French speakers. Now, these numbers don't take into account ability or language skill or proficiency. So not all of these German speakers may be native speakers, or a large number may be native speakers, but this is just a snapshot of the language diversity in Mississippi. I really encourage going to migration policy if you want to get an idea of not only the languages that are spoken across the state, but migration policy also gauges the ability of those speakers. So the proficiency is a better word, the proficiency of those speakers of those languages. So you can actually go to migration policy and see how many people identify as proficient at speaking German, or proficient at speaking Chinese, or proficient at speaking Vietnamese within this 7,000 for Vietnamese. You can actually get a gauge of proficiency level within those communities. So it's pretty cool information. But the big takeaway here, Mississippi is really linguistically diverse, and I think that's a really great thing, and it's a thing that we should be proud of, and it's something that we should take into account when we're thinking about our communities, when we think about our library patrons, and how we can better accommodate them and their needs. And this goes into making an ESL-friendly space as well, and I'll get into that a little bit later. Okay, so libraries, community ambassador. You guys really, really are the key to the door of information and access for our community members. So incorporating an ESL-friendly space or an ESL-friendly environment in your library is really, really crucial. Now, a quick snapshot of just some things that are popular in community centers and libraries. that I've noticed on my Google searches, things like cultural exchange hours, citizenship corners, book clubs, tutor times, traditional classroom style classes, online language learning resources, collection development. So we'll go through each of these and talk about them in a little bit more detail. Cultural exchange hours. These are really great informal ways for people to just come together, meet, practice just very basic conversation skills, meet fellow community members, and exchange information, exchange just perspectives about their cultures, where they come from. This is really, really good for facilitating cross-cultural relationships in the community and really building those bridges. It's really great. Citizenship corners, these I noticed in, again, my Google searches with ESL library services. Citizenship corners are pretty popular. So basically, an area of your library or display in your library, or basically just resources in your library that give information regarding the citizenship process. These are really helpful for those in the community who are seeking citizenship, and having it set up in a way where people can kind of go on their own and access and navigate that information on their own, I think is also an added feature that you may want to consider. Okay, book clubs. Never underestimate a good book club. But if you're doing this to incorporate like English language learning, this may work really well for English language learners in your community that have higher levels of English, that just really want to build on those skills. Because it takes a certain level of proficiency, one, to read, and then to be able to come and be in a group and report on it. So you want to consider, if you want to do ESL and book clubs, you want to consider proficiency level when you're thinking about who you want to reach out to. Okay, tutor time. I love this idea. If you know that you have a high population of ELLs, English language learners, in your local schools and school districts, maybe you can reach out and do a partnership and host like a tutor time and use the ESL resources at your library to help kind of make a friendly place for those students to come and study and get extra help if they need it. Okay, and a traditional classroom style class. So what do I mean by traditional class? Any ESL class where the grammar, the content, the vocabulary consistently builds on each other with each meeting, and you incorporate some sort of gauge for an outcome. Now, I talk more about this in the third installment, but the third installment of this webinar series, but that's basically what I mean by a traditional classroom style class, where, again, the information, the lessons, the grammar, the vocabulary builds with each meeting. Now, obviously, we don't want anything to be too formal. We don't want to really test or grade or anything like that. This is community learning, not an actual not an actual school, but there is kind of maybe an element of consistency in building that you'll want to incorporate in a traditional style course. Okay, online language learning resources. Look, if you don't have the staff or the resources or the time to actually host like a conversation class or a cultural exchange hour or something that requires you to be at a certain place for a certain amount of time, assess what you have in your library, assess what online resources you can have, and feature those. You know, at the very least, people can come in on their own and access those resources using your library, and they can self-study. That's great. That's a really, really great thing I highly encourage. And collection development plays into that as well. Look at what you guys have. I can assure you that you already have more than you probably realize. Do you have any old grammar books or old vocabulary books or old dictionaries laying around? Feature those. Let those be part of your ESL collection development. Graphic novels are great for teens or kids learning English. I mean, anything that you think would really reach across those barriers and really be inviting and good for English language learners in your communities. Okay, so think about your community, think about your community members, think about those you're trying to reach out to and you're trying to accommodate, and build your collection and your online resources and your programs based on that. You guys know that. You're all rock star librarians. Okay, so how do we get people through the door? You have all these great things you want to do, but how do you get people to actually show up? Well, never underestimate word of mouth. If you have a patron who is kind of a community ambassador for the populations you're trying to reach out to, get them to spread word. Utilize businesses. Anywhere you can put a flyer, put it there. And while you're at it, translate the flyers if possible. If nothing else, translate the key points using Google Translate. It may not be perfect, but it's efficient and it gets the point across. Look at other library programs. And just overall, be sure to create an ELL-friendly environment. Pay attention to things like signage. Again, this goes for flyers as well. Translate your signage. If you know you're trying to reach out to a large Spanish-speaking population, translate your library signage into Spanish. This may seem a little bit counterintuitive, but it's not. This goes into creating that ESL-friendly environment. You know, we want to create a space that's not just about helping patrons speak and understand English, but also how to navigate an English-speaking environment. And if you want to get people through the door, you want them to know, that there's also a space for them as well. And communicating that through signage is a really, really good way to do that. Okay, understand your resources. Make most of what you have. Really assess what you have. Again, I can assure you, you probably have more than you realize. And you can always build up these ESL resources later. Okay, so these are a few testimonials from libraries across the nation who offer ESL services. I really encourage you guys to check these little YouTube videos out. They're great for some good initial ideas, just to kind of see what their programs look like. Okay, King County Library, the first one. This video features their talk time and citizenship classes. At Squamish Public Library, this features their ESL story time for preschoolers. This is pretty cool. At San Jose Public Library, this is a feature on their English Conversation Club. In Watauga Public Library, this is a feature on their ESL programs. And as you watch these, just remember, content is adjustable. Do what you can. If you see something that you like, that you really want to incorporate in your library, that's fine. Take that, adjust it, mimic it, switch it up if you need to. If you see something that wouldn't really fit for your library, but you like a couple of features of it, go with that. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can mimic and adjust and mold, and I highly encourage you guys to do that. And here's some more links to some articles and some other library websites, just to give you an idea of what their ESL services look like, just to kind of get you on that sort of starting point. Okay, so I really like this question. I think that whenever we talk about programming, whenever we talk about outreach, whenever we talk about incorporating new materials or incorporating new curriculums or whatever it is, we really need to stop and ask ourselves, why does this matter? What's the point? Well, okay, keeping up to date with materials keeps our communities up to date. It keeps, as we develop our materials, it keeps that information that goes out to our communities developing, and that helps develop our communities. And what this results in is personal agency. Okay, with whatever information or programs or services that we offer our patrons, we want them to leave with a sense of personal agency, whatever it is. And creating an ESL-friendly environment in our library is really a great way to do that. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about language learning theory. This is something that I think is pretty important if you are interested in incorporating conversation clubs or a more traditional style class or anything where you will be teaching English, whether it's just basic vocabulary, where it's even if it's just basic, daily phrases. I really think it's important to understand a little bit about language acquisition just to make it easier for you. Okay, so we're going to talk very briefly about this. Language acquisition, what is it? Basically, it's how we acquire and develop language. Learning a second language poses different developmental stages than the ones we experience when learning our native language. So basically, when we learn a second language, we're going to learn it differently than we learned our native language. It makes sense, right? Okay, so keep in mind, when you're offering ESL services, conversation classes, whatever it is, keep in mind that age, beliefs, experiences, personality, all of that, all of what goes into making us who we are, all that determines how we learn language, and especially learn a second language. It determines how it's absorbed and how it's utilized by the learner or the student. So keep that in mind, okay, when you're trying to really critically think about your communities and you're trying to critically think about English language learners in your communities. Styles of language teaching. Some of these theories we're going to talk about, I feel like will be very helpful in some of your programming. So we'll talk very briefly about cooperative language learning or teaching. This is an approach to teaching that maximizes the use of cooperative activities. That literally means what it sounds like. So think pair work, group activities, where learners can develop their language skills by working, aka cooperating, with one another. Cooperative language learning fosters cooperation instead of competition and provides social scaffolding to the learner's interaction. We talk a little bit more about this in the developing a conversation class installment. But cooperative language learning, if you really want to facilitate connections across community members and really help community members get comfortable with working with each other in their ESL conversation classes or conversation hours, whatever you have, this is a really, really good style of teaching to use. So a byproduct of cooperative language learning is that as learners become more comfortable conversing with one another in the second language, more specific and contextual questions and interactions result. So that also helps kind of build that language learning. Okay? So now we're going to talk about content-based learning. So this is when a language is learned through teaching or learning other content. For example, when someone learns language through reading a news article or watching a TV program or reading their history textbook. So for example, if I want to study my Japanese, content-based learning would be me taking an article, like the one you see on the left, and trying to read it. And as I'm reading this article, as I'm trying to learn and understand this article, I make notes about vocabulary maybe I don't know and I go look it up, grammar that I don't know. And as I'm reading the article, as I'm learning about this current event, I'm developing my language skills. Okay? So content-based learning is popular in immersion classes. As well as language classes aimed at achieved at native fluency, as it forces learners to understand terminology, grammar, and overall message of the content that they are trying to understand at that moment. So this is really, really good for if you want to achieve native fluency in a language. Okay. Okay, so task-based language learning. This is really good. This is when language is learned through completing a task or a series of tasks. So, task-based language learning provides meaningful context to language learners, as you can have them complete tasks relevant to their goals. So consider tasks appropriate to the learner's experience, knowledge, and language level. So I talk about this in the second installment and the third installment. One thing you're always going to have to keep in mind is who is your audience? What language level do they have? Are you hosting ESL programs for intermediate to advanced English speakers? Or are you hosting it for novice level English speakers? That's something to keep in mind. Are you hosting ESL programs for novice levels English writers? What about writing skill? Does whatever you have, whatever task that you're having your ESL students, your ELLs learn, what skills does it require? Okay, so keep all of that in mind when you think about the learner's experience and knowledge. But some examples of tasks can include how to make a phone call, how to order food at a restaurant, how to fill out a job application, how to change language settings on a computer, how to buy a phone, how to buy a cell phone. And you can host a small cooking class. You can host ESL for those seeking jobs, job application sessions. You can do mock interviews. Any sort of task-based language learning is super flexible, but again, it does require you to really understand what your ELLs, your patrons, those community members need. So be sure to do your research and reading up on that. Okay, so let's do a brief recap. Start by thinking how your library accommodates patrons who are non-native speakers, non-native English speakers already. Think about it. Think about signage. Think about displays. Can you translate your signage easily? Can you make your displays more inclusive? If we want patrons to utilize our ESL services, we have to let them know, first and foremost, that there is a place in the library for them as they already are. And that includes translating signage, attempting to have communication with them in their native language. It doesn't necessarily have to be verbal from you, but letting them know that there is representation for them there. That's going to make a world of difference in and of itself, and it's going to make people more willing and more open to the idea of participating in library programs and ESL programs. Okay, so bringing ESL into your library does not necessarily mean incorporating an ESL class into programming. I want you guys to leave this webinar knowing that it's not make or break. Oh, I don't have the time or the staff or the ability to host a conversation class, so we just can't have ESL services. That's not the case at all. Develop your collection materials. Develop display materials. If the best that you can do is just feature online resources that people can use themselves, then that's the best you can do, and that's great. Develop that the most that you can. But other classes, if you do have the time and you are trying to get more creative with your programming, you can have craft classes, you can have book clubs, you can have cooking classes. Just like we talked about, keep in mind your community members that you're trying to reach, okay? You want to keep in mind things like experience, knowledge, possible language levels, you know, when you're trying to develop these program offerings or these resources, okay? So here's my contact information. If you have any questions, please, please, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. Again, my name is Natalie Dunaway. I'm the Continuing Education Coordinator with the Library Commission. Here's my email. Here's my phone number. Here's the resources that I used. I really like these two books here. Light by Patsy Lightbound and Nina Spada, How Languages Are Learned, and Approaches and Methods to Language Teaching by Jack Richards and Theodore Rogers. they're what I used in grad school, and they're great resources today to kind of get you thinking about how you kind of construct your programming and what to consider when you're thinking about teaching a foreign language or teaching a language to non-native speakers. So they're really good resources if you want to check them out. All right, thank you guys.